Good evening and welcome to 6-1. A referendum on abortion is expected to be held here next May or June. The Taoiseach said the vote would follow on from the recommendations of the All-Party Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. The committee is due to report by Christmas. The 8th Amendment guarantees the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn. The vote will be one of 7 referendums which are expected to be held over the next 2 years.
It's 34 years since people voted on the 8th Amendment. It was contentious then, and the protests at the gates of Leinster House in the last week are testament to the challenge it still poses for legislators. But now it's an issue they will have to address after this confirmation from the Taoiseach today.
The proposal, or at least the indicative proposal, is to have a standalone referendum on the 8th Amendment in May or June next year. And that'll very much follow on from the recommendations of the All-Party Committee.
That committee will have to look at proposals to repeal the amendment which guarantees the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn. There are mixed views among its members as to whether they can get this work done by December.
We're trying to actually have, a conversation that with an end, where the deadline is for Christmas, but I wouldn't hold out on it.
This issue can be dealt with in 3 months, so long as we're willing to put in the time. And from what I gather from the committee, they seem extremely committed to attaining that goal.
A failure by the committee to get its report done on time could possibly delay plans for a May or June referendum. But most sides in Leinster House believe the timetable is workable.
I think it's something that certainly needs to be done, and I think minds are focused on having a referendum next year, and we would certainly support that.
This referendum is one of 7 the government is planning to hold over the next 2 years. But right now there isn't a plan to have a vote that would guarantee Irish water stays in state ownership, much to the surprise of some parties.
Why should long finger a proposal which has universal acceptance from right across the spectrum, Fianna Fáil, the various independent groups, the alliances, Labour and indeed most of Fine Gael.
But finding consensus here on the wording of a proposal on the 8th Amendment may prove more problematic, however.
Well, Micheál is standing by for us now. May, June, it is a tight enough deadline, isn't it, Micheál, given the requirement for legislation to be drawn up and given the need for full and proper debate to be had on this most sensitive of topics?
After 34 years, Sharon, it is a tight deadline, but I suppose some things are different this time. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael TDs will have a free vote on this, so when that committee completes its work and proposals come back into the Dáil and the proposal that will ultimately go to the people is voted on, that perhaps should take some of the heat out of the debate and allow for progress on it. That is one of the key differences. And there's no doubting too that this is a big political priority, because while the government may be talking about 7 referendums over the next 2 years, there is a reality here that mapping the future for this government is a particularly difficult one, given the makeup of the Dáil and the uncertainty over its long-term future. So I think there is a certain energy behind this to try and make progress in the next number of months, and that could make the difference in getting it over the line in terms of getting a proposal to the people early next summer.
Micheál, thank you.
Just day. Independent TD Mattie McGrath and Senator Ronan Mullen have said they are considering whether or not to remain as members of the Joint Committee on the 8th Amendment. At a news conference this afternoon, Mattie McGrath outlined his concerns.
When we speak, we're ridiculed, there's sneers and there's all kind of undermining, and when we ask honest questions in a very calm manner, questions that we have prepared to our witnesses, which they don't mind being asked because they're coming in as experts, but there's all kind of gasps and wahoo's, and I've been called a liar by a committee member, which I didn't tell any lies whatsoever.
Well, let's talk now to our political correspondent, Micheál Lehane. Micheál, what are the concerns of Mattie McGrath and Ronan Mullen, and what's been the response, if any, from the committee?
Well, I suppose given the at times divisive nature of this debate, finding agreement during committee meetings was always going to prove to be a difficult task. But Ronan Mullen and Mattie McGrath say it runs a lot deeper than that, going so far as to describe the whole thing as a propaganda exercise. They're particularly concerned over what they say is a lack of time given to them to question witnesses, and they say too that they haven't got a chance to call in the witnesses or experts they would like to hear from. Now, in the last few moments I've spoken to the committee chairperson Catherine Noon, and here was her response to those criticisms.
I have been very fair and impartial in how the time has been allocated, and in many instances the two individuals who have made the complaints have had a lot more time than other members, and I have been very impartial at all times.
Brian, I suppose this row shows the difficult task facing this committee, but it is due to conclude its work by Christmas, but we don't know this evening if Matthew McGrath and Ronan Mullen will be a part of that process.
Micheál Lehane, Leinster House, thank you for that.
Members of the Oireachtas Committee considering the abortion issue have voted by a majority in favour of repealing the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which recognises the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn child. The cross-party committee also voted by a majority to recommend making the termination of pregnancy lawful with no restrictions up until 12 weeks. The Taoiseach said today that it was achievable to have a referendum on the 8th Amendment by May of next year.
For the past 3 months here at Leinster House, 21 members of one committee have been considering recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on the 8th Amendment. With the final public session due to take place this afternoon, there was anticipation over the first vote of the day on whether or not it would recommend to the Oireachtas that Article 43.3 be removed from the Constitution.
Obviously, it's the people who will decide at the end of the day, but I think that's the way the committee is going to go. We have been embedded in this committee for the last few months, and I think all of the expert witnesses that came in front of us were very helpful.
Well, I think this is a very exciting day for women who've been campaigning, like myself, for 34 years plus, to have abortion rights in this country.
The Labour TD Jan O'Sullivan made the proposal to repeal Article 43.3 from the Constitution, otherwise known as repeal simpliciter. That was countered by a proposal from Deputy Mattie McGrath.
It's my view, and I think the view of others on the committee, that a repeal simpliciter is the most clear way of dealing with the issue.
The deletion of Article 40.33 is not required to protect the life of the mother. It is possible to provide any additional clarity that may be required by medical professionals by way of ordinary legislation and/or amended medical practice guidelines.
14 members of the committee voted to recommend to the Oireachtas to repeal the 8th Amendment. 6 voted against, and the chairperson, Senator Catherine Noone, she abstained. Later, a majority of 12 members to 5 voted in favour of a motion to recommend dealing with the issue of pregnancy as a result of rape by making the termination of pregnancy lawful with no restriction up to a limit of 12 weeks.
I understand the points people are making, but this is proposing 12 weeks as outlined, and I think if we get overly prescriptive in whether it is medical or surgical, we potentially tie the hands of the experts.
The committee is continuing its meeting this evening. Alba Keneally, RTE News, Leinster House.
For more, we're joined now by our political correspondent, Micheál Lehane at Leinster House. So, Micheál, to sum up, would it be correct to say the stage is now set for a highly emotive referendum at some stage next year?
Yes, Ray, I think this is a really significant moment because the laws around social issues can remain unchanged here for several decades, particularly if they cause unease within the political system. And then very suddenly the ground can shift and things can change in a way that seemed unlikely even a year ago. And I think we witnessed that this afternoon down in the committee rooms on 2 fronts. That decision to recommend repealing the 8th Amendment and also recommending abortion without restrictions to get around the complexities of cases of rape and incest without restrictions up to 12 weeks. They are big recommendations to come from that committee, and I know they're not binding, but this committee is important and you couldn't overstate its importance. That's because the report will go back into the Dáil, in a Dáil where a government doesn't have a majority, so they will be influenced more than ever by what this committee says. And we know too that there is a referendum on the way. The Taoiseach saying he hopes to have it in May. And much of the work around this in relation to legislation and perhaps proposals is already underway in the Department of Health. The Health Minister saying this morning that he is considering all options and is doing early preliminary work on that. That would suggest we could see legislation in February, and there is most likely going to be a referendum in May that is going to offer the clearest of choices.
Micheál Lehane, thank you.
Let's return now to our main story and that vote by the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment. We're joined now by its chairwoman, Senator Catherine Noone. She joins us from our Dáil studio. Catherine, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. This majority vote in favour of repealing Article 43.3, is it your understanding now that the Oireachtas will press ahead with referendum wording and proposed legislation with this repeal at its core?
I would expect that our report will inform how the Oireachtas proceeds, so I think it would be fair to say yes to that question.
And we also have today, Senator Noone, this vote, I think it was 12-5, to allow for termination with no restrictions up until 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Give us an insight into why we're looking at no restrictions.
Well, it's a very good question because it's important, I suppose, to inform the viewing public who aren't as engaged in the process as we have been, or indeed the people who have been watching it very closely. A consistent theme that has come up is the question of abortion pills. And I believe we voted the way we did today because as a committee, I didn't actually vote myself, I abstained, but as a committee we voted to cover situations where Irish women are procuring abortion pills online and taking them in uncontrolled environments. That was a huge informing factor in the decision that was made today, and it was an issue that Justice Lafoy pointed out as something that she felt that we should do more on, and we did, and it was a consistent theme.
So this will be, Senator Noone, a GP-led service. Was it also designed to deal with the intricacies of rape allegations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, primarily, I should say that it was rape and incest, that reason that brought about this amendment in the first place, because the complexities of both of those very difficult scenarios are, I suppose, we're helped in legislating for those by going forward with the motion that we did today, right, or voting on that. Yeah.
Yes, and the committee also voted for terminations to be legal when not just the life of the woman is at risk, but the health of the woman. How do we define health in these circumstances?
Well, I suppose it's important that we remember that we're legislators and it's really up to doctors to decide on matters of health. And I think that was a predominant theme in our deliberations, the fact that, really we have to defer to doctors in these circumstances to determine the very question that you ask.
Right. And do you anticipate that there will be term limits on that particular issue?
On the issue of
health,
I mean, it'll be 12 weeks, I would imagine, based on what we voted on today. But beyond that, we didn't vote beyond 12 weeks on anything.
Okay.
And we didn't get into the gestational periods,
right,
that the Citizens' Assembly actually went through. We went about our work in a slightly different way, but the bottom line is that we made the decision that you referred to at the beginning there.
Right, and similarly, we also had a majority vote in favour of abortion in cases where the unborn child has a fetal abnormality likely to result in death before or shortly after birth.
Yes.
What more can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that there has been a lot of talk about this particular area, and I think the sincere expressions today were that empathy would be shown to women in those circumstances, that we got a lot of testimony on both sides of the argument, but that I think the majority, I don't speak for everybody obviously as chair, I speak for the committee as a whole, but I think the majority of people felt that in the case of fetal abnormality, and indeed some people are uncomfortable comfortable with that definition. But in the case of those that the doctors need to be given some input, and that women would have some choice in those circumstances.
And Senator, finally, there has been quite a bit of acrimony throughout these proceedings. More of it today. The committee accused of being a lynch mob. Today, there was the criticism about pro-abortion experts being invited to give evidence. Do you anticipate a very fraught campaign?
I suppose, in a way, it's for another day. It has been a very difficult committee to chair, I have to say, and it is a very divisive issue, and I think naturally people are going to disagree on an issue like this, and I think that we need to be very respectful of everybody's views going forward. This process is a 3-stage process, and we're only just finished the 2nd stage, and it moves now on to the Oireachtas, and obviously the debate will intensify as we come closer to a referendum, and it is going to be difficult. It is a difficult discussion, and it was a difficult committee. It's difficult work, and it's work that has to be done. And, after the guts of 40 years of it not being dealt with, the Oireachtas are now dealing with it. And I think we should be proud of that fact. All right. Well, Senator Catherine Noone, thank you very much for joining us on the programme this evening. And sorry for delaying you. No problem. Thank you. Thank you.
The Taoiseach has said he anticipates the Cabinet will act collectively in the upcoming referendum on abortion. Leo Varadkar also said there would be a special Fine Gael parliamentary meeting in the new year, and the Dáil will debate the issue.
What I would anticipate is Cabinet acting collectively, as it always does. So if we put a procedure or a proposition to the Dáil and Seanad, that would be a collective decision of the Cabinet. But that is not to say that people couldn't dissent from that. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but Cabinet can only operate collectively. Even in the old days, when there were votes at Cabinet, and that probably hasn't happened for decades, you could have 8 people voting one way, 2 people voting the other, but they would all agree that this was the collective decision of the Cabinet, but that wouldn't prevent them from dissenting from it.
Our political correspondent Martina Fitzgerald joins us now. Martina, the Taoiseach providing clarity there on what the Cabinet will do. Is there any surprise in that?
Not really, because we had been hearing since last Wednesday, after the All-Party Oireachtas Committee had voted on its various recommendations, all the soundings for government was there was going to be a government position, and that ministers would be expected to toe the line when the legislation underpinning the holding of a referendum and the wording came before the Dáil. Now, why is that so interesting? Why would that not be normal practice? Well, because Fine Gael policy has that there would be a free vote on this issue. That will be decided at a special Fine Gael parliamentary party in relation to backbenchers, but I think he is clearly stating that he would expect a collective cabinet decision on the issue, and it would have been difficult if a different scenario had been the case. But remember, there are different views within cabinet and they have yet to discuss it. He also said he wanted a sound proposition put before the people, and there was still a lot more work to do, but he is holding to a May or June referendum.
Martina Fitzgerald, thanks for that.
Now, the final report of the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment has recommended that it should be repealed and abortion should be legal up to 12 weeks. However, a second report launched by 3 members of the committee favours retaining the amendment, which recognises the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn child.
Good afternoon, colleagues.
The audiovisual room at Leinster House was full to capacity this morning for the launch of the 8th Committee's final report.
I know that what the committee is proposing is a major change, and it will take time for both the public and other politicians in here to consider and understand how we came to these recommendations.
The report, which reflects votes by members last week, suggests repealing the 8th Amendment, decriminalising abortion and allows for terminations up to 12 weeks.
It was an amazing process. I mean, I learned so much. Of course, I went in there with a position, but I came out of it much stronger in that position and much more sure of how I felt about it. And that was because of the facts: scientific, human rights, legal.
3 committee members did not sign off on the final report. Instead, they made their own recommendations for the 8th Amendment to be retained and for it not to be put to a vote. The Minority Report also recommends that high-quality, appropriate perinatal and palliative care be provided across the country, and it calls for the provision of pregnancy counselling which would encourage positive alternatives to abortion for women in crisis pregnancy.
I would hope that the Irish people in the end will insist on a law in this country that leaves no child behind, that guarantees every necessary medical treatment for women in pregnancy, as has been the case up to now in our law.
We're talking about human beings' life, and I don't think that should go to a referendum in a moment. And I said earlier on, I'm disappointed that the Taoiseach of this country has stated that there should be a referendum even before the committee sit down.
The Dáil will debate the issue in January. The government now has to prepare the wording of a bill to hold a referendum. Alva Keneally, RTE News, Leinster House.
The Fianna Fáil leader Micheál Martin has said the government will have to plan for every scenario in relation to Brexit, given the infighting within the British Conservative Party. He was speaking at his party's Ardèche, where delegates voted by a significant majority to oppose any attempt to diminish the constitutional rights of the unborn.
Lots of policy issues were discussed at today's Ardèche, but one dominated: the 8th Amendment.
The 8th Amendment has had a hugely positive, humane and life-saving impact on society. Our abortion rates are a fraction of those in Britain.
But I think it is time that we stand up and that we support our women, that we stop making Irish women put their lives in risk and jeopardy travelling to receive what is essentially healthcare.
And delegates voted by a significant majority to protect the rights of the unborn.
Similar motions with similar results have been passed at previous Fianna Fáil events, but this one is taking place in the run-up to a potential referendum. The Fianna Fáil leadership, though, has been clear members will get a free vote, so they're not bound by today's results, but they'll be mindful of them. Martina Fitzgerald, RTE News, the RDS.
Concerns have been raised about fire safety at the new National Children's Hospital after it emerged fire safety conditions are being appealed to An Bord Pleanála. The appeal is related to cost control, according to the Minister for Children, who said safety will not be compromised.
Building work for the new National Children's Hospital commenced earlier this year after many years of delay. Today it was revealed the hospital's development board has appealed to An Bord Pleanála 3 of 4 fire safety conditions imposed on it by Dublin City Council Fire Department. The appeal is based on cost control, but won't compromise safety, according to the Minister for Children.
The primary responsibility and concern is the safety of our children. Full stop, end of story. At the same time, they do have to have an eye in relation to the costs in terms of the hospital. And so I think with those concerns, they questioned whether or not they needed to meet these 3 certain conditions.
This afternoon,
the pro-life campaign has accused the Oireachtas Committee examining changing Ireland's abortion laws of acting like a pro-choice advocate. Speakers from a broad range of backgrounds gave presentations at its national conference in Dublin today.
Emma Maloney was 23 when she got pregnant. It was unplanned, but she says her baby was wanted. Rossa is now 2 years old.
I'm so grateful that the 8th Amendment was there when I was going through a crisis pregnancy, because it stopped me from making a quick and wrong decision when I was facing a moment of panic.
Emma was one of many speakers at the Pro-Life campaign's national conference in Dublin today.
First, they come to marginalise a specific population, in this case the unborn, and then we will see different populations being marginalised. Now in the United States, 90% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. Now we see physician-assisted suicide sweeping across the country, focusing on the elderly.
Really, the sanitised version that we're hearing from the Oireachtas Committee is not the reality of what abortion really means. And what we have is a Oireachtas Committee where we only had 4 pro-life advocates speaking versus 24. And in essence, what we are having is an Oireachtas Committee that is essentially a pro-choice advocate.
The chair of the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment defended its position.
The reality is, it's easy for the pro-life campaign to say that 24-4, that resonates very well. The reality is that the vast majority of witnesses appearing before our committee are pro-women's healthcare, and they're dealing with women's healthcare at the coalface.
The debate over Ireland's abortion laws is likely to intensify over the coming months, with the referendum expected to be held next year. Diane Connor, RTE News.
The leader of the Catholic Church in Ireland has urged believers to respectfully lobby their public representatives not to proceed with the proposed relaxation of the Republic's abortion laws. In a pastoral message for the new year, Archbishop Eamon Martin warns that the recent Oireachtas Committee proposals, including abortion without restriction up to 12 weeks, would lead to what he described as a very liberal abortion regime. He urges Catholics to resist what he called strong pressures to remain silent in the forthcoming referendum. The leader of the country's Catholics has said he was shocked by last month's Oireachtas Committee recommendations, which he says may make it easier to get an abortion here than in Sweden or Britain. Archbishop Eamon Martin was elaborating on his New Year message, urging Catholics to respectfully lobby their public representatives not to repeal the Eighth Amendment.
Archbishop Martin's New Year message ends a fortnight of comparative silence in the abortion debate here, since the Oireachtas Committee published its final report urging radical relaxation of the Republic's abortion laws.
I really wonder if that is what the Irish people would expect at this stage, that Ireland is going to introduce an abortion regime similar to Britain, similar to Sweden, where 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 of all pregnancies end in abortion. In the debates so far, people have always thought we were talking about very hard cases, and there are very difficult cases, which I think any country has to struggle with. But suddenly what's being proposed is a completely unrestricted liberal abortion regime. That's the shock factor.
Archbishop Martin also urged Catholics to resist what he called strong pressures to remain silent on the issue and not to be afraid to give witness to every individual's right to life, from conception to natural death.
I think he's dead right, and I agree entirely.
There were mixed views among morning mass-goers at Dundalk's Redemptorist Monastery in Dr. Martin's archdiocese.
Abortion is a fact of life, really, as it is at the moment. That's what that does happen, and it's I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's there, and it's available.
Well, I'm against abortion, so yeah.
Do you think public representatives are listening to people of your disposition?
Absolutely not. I think abortion is a private matter and it's up to the person themselves. Everybody has their own story and nobody knows what's going on behind closed doors.
Government sources have indicated that a cabinet decision on holding an abortion referendum in May would need to be taken in about a fortnight. Joe Little, RTE News, Dundalk.
The Taoiseach has said that there is concern amongst many politicians that the proposal to allow abortion without restriction up to 12 weeks may go one step too far for the majority of the public. However, Leo Varadkar also said that he understood the logic of the Oireachtas Committee's recommendation, given the widespread availability of the abortion pill. Well, for more on this, our political correspondent Micheál Lehane joins us now. Micheál, there was a cabinet meeting around this today. What do you know of what was discussed at that?
Keelan, abortion is one of those issues that politicians simply don't like talking about. So this discussion at Cabinet today was the first substantive one really about the issue, and it went on for 2 hours, and I understand that all ministers spoke. They heard too from the Health Minister, who says a number of things have to happen if that expected referendum is to take place either in late May or early June. And they include making a decision on whether or not to accept the Oireachtas Committee's report that was published before Christmas. Also, having a referendum bill that will essentially pose the question that will be put to the people. And there is the accompanying legislation which will set out what would replace any possible changes in the Constitution. But of course, on that Oireachtas Committee's report, there was one recommendation that has been discussed more than most by politicians already, and that was the one that called for unrestricted abortion up to 12 weeks. And the Taoiseach has been speaking about that. He said that recommendation went further than many of the public, and indeed he himself could have anticipated 2 years ago. Here's what he had to say.
I understand the logic behind that and why they came to that decision, particularly given the widespread availability now of the abortion pill and the fact that people are getting that over the internet and are using it without medical supervision all over Ireland every day in homes in all sorts of places. So I understand why they came to that decision, but I think people will want to think about that. There's a concern, understandably, among many politicians that perhaps for the majority of the public that proposal might go one step too far. But then again, perhaps not. So that's the debate we're going to have over the next few months.
And Micheál, listening to the Taoiseach there, I mean, a number of senior cabinet ministers have already said that they support this 12-week issue. How do you read the Taoiseach's comments?
I think they are significant. I think the fact that 7 members of the Cabinet have accepted the recommendations of the committee was seen that a majority were moving in that direction, and that perhaps is still the case. But the Taoiseach there reflecting a concern that is felt here in Leinster House that perhaps those recommendations may be out of kilter with a majority view of the public. Now, the question then is, does the government have any room to manoeuvre here? And it seems they don't. The sense I'm getting this evening is that any real altering of those committee recommendations would be politically fraught. Now, we will get a greater sense of political concerns here over the next few days. The Fine Gael Parliamentary Party will meet on Monday, and then over 3 days here at Leinster House next week, the committee recommendations will be debated in some detail. But I think what we've really got a sense of today is that this issue continues to pose a major political challenge and will do so in the months ahead.
OK, well, Micheál Lehane, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
We've had the discussion about the expression abortion on demand. Don't particularly want to use it necessarily to stigmatise the phenomenon, but merely to describe it. Let's take another expression which is used by those who are enthusiastic for legalised abortion. That is the expression abortion based on the right to choose. I've always been struck, perhaps you have too, that nobody finishes that sentence. Nobody ever finishes the sentence, the right to choose. And if you do finish the sentence, it becomes not so self-evidently obvious, but highly disturbing to any person of humane sensibility. The right to choose to take the life of another person.
Minister, whatever happens between now and next May, this one does not have the feel of the marriage equality referendum, given the kinds of tensions we've seen already on this committee before it ever gets to the Dáil. No one's going to be, cheerfully calling their granny on this one. Do you think a new generation is going to learn how bitter and divisive referendums on abortion can be?
I think they really are. And it's not something, I have to be honest with you, that I'm looking forward to, because I think it's incumbent upon all of us, whether we're parliamentarians or members of the public, we have to inform ourselves better than perhaps we have been informed in the past. And if you look at the makeup of the committee, it's probably similar to the public. Some people on each end and the vast majority in the middle. And I just hope that people will be respectful of each other's views. I've my own views. I tend not to try and shove them down anybody else's throat. Everyone is entitled to their own view, and I respect other people's views, but that hasn't happened in any abortion referendum in the past, whether it's 02, 92 or 83. I was a teenager in 83, and I remember that, and it wasn't a pleasant occasion. And I think you add into an abortion referendum, you add social media, and it has the capacity to be a very unpleasant experience.
And the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, finally, that we started talking about, do you agree that those recommendations would pass neither party, Dáil nor country?
I do.
All right, we leave it there. And welcome back. The Citizens' Assembly proposed to repeal and replace the 8th Amendment and recommended legalising abortion on several grounds, including up to 3 months without restriction. This week, the Committee on the 8th Amendment voted for straight repeal and a similar range of grounds for abortion. The majority report will be published next week, and then the choice about what to put to the people passes back to the Cabinet and the Dáil in the new year. Ava Keneally reports.
In our law today,
there were protests, there were hours of meetings, and there were walkouts. It's been an eventful 3 months for the Oireachtas 8th Amendment Committee. Having voted to recommend that the Oireachtas repeal the 8th Amendment and allow for terminations without restrictions up to 12 weeks of pregnancy, the committee's final report will be published on Wednesday.
Obviously now we're handing over to ourselves in the Oireachtas, along with our colleagues, in facilitating a vote of the Irish people, who will ultimately be the decision makers on this.
But for those on the committee that want to see the lives of the mother and the child remaining equal in the Constitution, there's disappointment over the process.
It's a choreographed layout from start to finish. This was all in the great plan, but they're not. They should never forget that the people out there are wise, and they will make their own decisions in the privacy of the ballot boxes.
Those in favour of retaining the 8th Amendment will produce their own proposals next week.
We couldn't have any association with a report as heartless and as sadly irresponsible as that. We will be making our own recommendations.
The committee's final report will go to government when it's published on Wednesday, but there's a tight time frame regarding the wording of legislation underpinning the referendum, if it's to take place in May or even June.
What the government will do here is, yes, we will of course prioritise and try to expedite legislation in order to try to facilitate the timeline that the Taoiseach, I know, wants the government to follow, which is to hold a referendum in May. That is going to be very tight, though, given the demands to put legislation and to get the balance right in that legislation, and of course to bring forward legislation to facilitate the setting up of a referendum commission and all of the other things that have to happen before a referendum can take place.
For now, the government awaits that final report, and all parties will have the Christmas period to consider and digest its recommendations. Needless to say, it'll be one of the more significant items on the agenda when the Dáil resumes in January.
And how does that square, Fionn Sheehan, with the quote from one minister earlier in the year in reaction to the Citizens' Assembly that their proposals would pass neither party, Dáil nor country?
Well, I suppose the proposals have been moderated to a degree by the Oireachtas Committee. If anything, the Oireachtas Committee has served the following purpose. They provided us with an answer to the question of, so what replaces the 8th Amendment? Whereas up until now, you've had a lot of opinion polls that have really asked you the question, are you in favour of repealing the 8th Amendment? And a majority from existing opinion poll data has suggested that there is. But you haven't got the tack on of like where exactly do you go after that. And there is, even going back to the RTE's own general election data, which is probably the most accurate snapshot of where voter sentiment is at from last year, it would suggest that there is still a strong middle ground there that maybe isn't, we're not quite clear, is it as liberal as is being indicated here. Counterintuitively, from a pro-life campaign perspective, it'll probably suit them better to actually have a proposal being put forward in terms of not just a straightforward question, yes or no, but here is what will replace it, in that they will be able to point to, well, this is what the regime that will come instead. So while you are having the pro-life campaigners attacking both the Citizens' Assembly and also the Oireachtas Committee, probably what has come out of it suits them a lot better than just that straightforward question.
And can this campaign, Dermot, be different this time? I mean, politicians still have bitter memories of their experiences of the Protection of Life and Pregnancy Act. There will be some of them who will remember 1992 and even 83.
Well, you'd like to think so. There's a generation of people, including myself, who never had a chance to vote on this particular issue. This hasn't come before the people in this manner, at least, for 35 years. And I think what's interesting, I know from wearing my newspaper hat, that it's been very interesting to see the level of correspondence we've got from people who are in favour of retaining the 8th Amendment. But the battle being waged by the pro-choice side has very much taken place in social media. So there's a generational issue at work here. And the fact that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are going to be internally split on this means it is going to be a difficult sell. And I do wonder, are we going to have more than one question on the referendum ballot? How can a simple thought and kneel suffice on this? This is the greyest of grey issues. And it is a very, very unfortunate means of addressing a very complex issue. And as Justine pointed out, the fact that socio and economic factors was ruled out of bounds by the committee was probably unfortunate to a certain degree, because there are women out there who are facing incredible levels of pressures, which a lot of the people in the Dáil would in reality have no knowledge of. Let's face it. No more than any of us sitting here today.
If was a vote taken by the committee, I suppose the question over the new year that many of the politicians now have to ponder is whether that's the question, whether they put those questions to the people directly, or whether by doing that the Cabinet is in effect endorsing those proposals. And that will be the first question that they will have to grapple with, and whether there is in fact Simon Harris looking, isn't he, for a united front, whether that can emerge. Chances are...
Sure, you're not even guaranteed your Taoiseach is going to support these proposals, so I don't really think that's too much of a clever tack for Simon Harris to be going down. I mean, he's a guy who only 5 or 6 years ago was saying he was going to leave Fine Gael at a parliamentary party meeting if there was any move in this direction. So, I mean,
The Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Dermot Martin, has said he is optimistic that the proposed papal visit to Ireland will go ahead next year. He was speaking in Knock, County Mayo, at the launch of the World Meeting of Families programme.
Thousands of people have been attending the annual 9-day novena in Knock, and for those with a special devotion to the Virgin Mary, today was a significant date. Monday, August 21st, marks the anniversary of the reported apparition of Our Lady at Knock Shrine. But pilgrims were also talking of the much-anticipated visit of Pope Francis to coincide with the World Meeting of Families in Dublin next year.
Oh, I love him, yeah. Yes, I do think he's a people's Pope, not up there and we're down here.
He understands life so well and how people live life now, and he has been very well accepted by the people of the world.
A newly commissioned icon of the Holy Family was unveiled during Mass at the Basilica. It will travel to every diocese nationwide ahead of the World Festival of Families next year. Later, Archbishop Martin said the Taoiseach's plans to hold a referendum on abortion next year should not impact on the papal visit.
He has gone to countries where abortion is introduced. He'd be well able to deal with situations like that.
So you wouldn't have any worries about him becoming embroiled in something like that?
I would hope that people would not try to embroil the Pope in something that is marginal to what he's coming for.
All the indications are that Pope Francis will visit Ireland next year, although official confirmation won't take place until nearer the time. The Pope's age is a key factor in the final decision, and any visit here would be tailored to meet his needs. Teresa Mannion, RTE News, Knock, County Mayo.
The Taoiseach and Minister for Justice Frances Fitzgerald has said she believes there should be a referendum on abortion next year. This follows yesterday's vote by the Citizens' Assembly to recommend an extensive liberalisation of the legal grounds on which abortion may be provided here. The Assembly will now send its report to the Oireachtas. A special committee will consider it and in turn issue its report. It'll then be a matter for the Government and the Dáil to recommend any constitutional change.
The recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly took the political world by surprise. Few had expected the body to take such a liberal view, but the consensus nonetheless was that the outcome had set the country on course for a referendum.
My own thinking is that there should be a referendum next year, that we now will see what the committee that's being established to look at this precisely. They will do that over the course of the next number of months.
Sentiments echoed by Fianna Fáil, who insisted, though, that a 3-month deadline for the Oireachtas committee that will now chart the course ahead was too tight.
I think initially they were looking at a 3-month time frame. I would respectfully suggest that this is too short. It's very, very complex, and I think that it will need to be a longer period than that.
But Labour insisted legislators had to press ahead.
34 years since the amendment was put into the Constitution, and it has never served the Irish people well. We need now to ensure that the legislators actually make decisions on this very complex and difficult issue.
While Sinn Féin maintained the Dáil should not be bound by the Assembly's recommendations.
Absolutely not. The Assembly has made recommendations, and that's all that they are. They will form the basis of our discussions. Sinn Féin has outlined very, very early on our position with regard to the 8th Amendment. We believe that it should be repealed and to allow for access determinations in the cases as outlined under the Protection of Life During Pregnancy, also in the cases of rape, incest and fatal fetal abnormality.
So, back to the legislators, but many twists ahead on the road to another controversial referendum. David Davenport, RTE News, Leinster House.
Well, abortion has proven to be one of the most intractable issues in Irish politics. Our reporter Sharon Tobin looks back on the challenges it's posed to previous governments.
From the foundation of the state, abortion was illegal in Ireland. But in the early 1980s, fears surrounding the liberalisation of abortion in Britain and elsewhere put enormous pressure on politicians to act.
There was this concern that unborn children weren't being given the value that we have always given them in Ireland, and that's what led to the 8th Amendment to the 1983 referendum.
It was at the height of the Charlie Haughey and Garrett Fitzgerald power struggle when the divisive debate on abortion ensued. A referendum was put to the people, and the right to life of the unborn was enshrined in Ireland's constitution in 1983 in Article 40.3.3, or the 8th Amendment. But then came the X case, a 14-year-old girl who was raped and suicidal and was blocked by the High Court from travelling for an abortion.
We saw for the first time the clear conflict arising between the right to life of the woman, in this case a very young girl of 14 who was pregnant, and the right to life of the fetus that she carries.
Ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that Miss X should be allowed to travel for an abortion for the sake of her own life. Two subsequent referendums in 1992 and again in 2002 failed to reverse the X case ruling, but in law nothing changed. Then, 20 years after the X case judgment, Savita Halappanavar died following a miscarriage after being refused a termination. Her death, along with the European Court of Human Rights ruling that Ireland must clarify its law on abortion, forced the government to act. A law providing access to abortion where a pregnant woman's life is at risk was passed. But the Irish people have never actually voted on whether abortion without restrictions should be allowed in this country. A majority on the Citizens' Assembly believe it should. But now it'll again be up to government to decide if that is a question it could face asking in any future referendum. Sharon Tobin, RTE News.
A word with David Davenport now. He joins us from Leinster House. As we heard there, we've been kicking this particular can, this most difficult and contentious of issues, down the road for decades, David. Has the time come where we're finally going to deal with it?
Sharon, we might be approaching the end game, but as always, the timing is critical. The first thing to say is that the very liberal package of recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly took people very much by surprise here. There was astonishment across all parties that they had recommended something that, it has to be said, is politically unsaleable. Only around 24% of the electorate in the last comparable opinion poll backed a regime that is that liberal. So the task of this committee that will be meeting from June onwards is essentially to water down these proposals to the point that they're not politically toxic, because if this package was put to the people, the view in Leinster House certainly is that it would surely fail. But of course the timing and the timescale is a problem, because with the best will in the world, this committee, if it sits in June and reports in September, if it works through the summer, there will be very limited legislative time when the Dáil returns in October. We have the budget, we have the social welfare bill. So effectively, the first time we could contemplate having any referendum on this is next year, maybe around April next year. And of course, that's the time when we could be facing a general election if the pact between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael unravels. But one thing I have detected around Leinster House today is that there does seem to be a will to crack on with this now, if only to make sure that the issue is disposed of before that general election. But ultimately, this will be a problem for a new Taoiseach and potentially a new government.
David Davenport at Leinster House, thank you. The Taoiseach has asked that the Dáil meet on Friday to debate legislation to allow for a referendum on the 8th Amendment to take place in May. The government is awaiting a decision from the Supreme Court tomorrow. The Supreme Court is examining the rights of the unborn in the Constitution. Tonight, Ireland's Catholic bishops have entered the debate. In a statement, they said it would be a shocking step if Irish society were to deprive the unborn of their right to life.
I think what astounds us is the very rapid rush to effectively obliterate the right to life of the unborn from our constitution. Far from an bheag an brech, as the Irish version of our constitution puts it, a living being just waiting to be born. Essentially, the state has been arguing, in the Supreme Court case, for example, that this is a non-citizen, a non-person, a non-child, effectively removing every vestige of right to life from the baby in the womb.
Well, Joe Little is in Maynooth for us this evening. The heads of the various dioceses around the country, Joe, at this spring meeting, what else are they saying?
Yes, this statement comes midway through their regular spring meeting, and the representatives of the 26 dioceses around the country are clearly very perturbed by the state's efforts in the Supreme Court to, as Archbishop Martin said there, to obliterate the rights of the unborn, which Judge Richard Humphreys found existed. He said in a judgment about a deportation that the state was obliged to consider the rights of the unborn child of a man who they were about to deport. And Judge Humphreys said that there are many more rights than simply the right to life provided for in the Eighth Amendment throughout the Constitution, which referred to the rights of the unborn child. So the Catholic bishops are clearly alarmed by the state's very determined efforts to get a judgment through the representations at the Supreme Court hearings that the unborn child's rights are very limited indeed. The bishops in their statement also say that women made pregnant by rape and women expecting children who are terminally ill ought to be loved and cherished by society, but they take a very firm stand against providing abortion in these very sensitive and hard cases, but also in the wider cases like that advocated by the Oireachtas Committee, where you'd have abortion without having to give reason for having one, up to 12 weeks gestation. So obviously this statement comes on the eve not just of the Supreme Court judgment, but of the Cabinet decision to vote through legislation that would follow what they hope would be the passing of a referendum in May on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment.
OK, Joe Little in Maynooth, thank you.
Now, ministers in Ireland have approved a referendum bill on whether to amend the constitution, making it easier for women to have abortions. The current law gives a mother and her unborn child an equal right to life, and this has been the basis for strict abortion controls. The nationwide referendum will be held in May. Our correspondent Chris Page has been hearing the arguments on both sides.
This is a nation which was once seen as the most socially conservative in Western Europe. But it feels like change has been swift. In the next few months, Ireland will make a defining decision.
I think it's in here.
Tens of thousands of Irish women have travelled to other countries to have abortions.
And in fact,
Gay Edwards' baby, who she and her husband named Joshua, had a fatal condition called anencephaly. She says having to go away to end her pregnancy magnified her grief.
While I knew that I had come to the right decision for me, it made me